Helmand Province burned under a sun that had forgotten mercy. March 2011. The sandstorm screamed across the airstrip like a living thing, turning the sky into a wall of amber fury. An FA-18 Super Hornet sat motionless on the tarmac, its sleek body coated in dust that made it look like something dragged from an ancient tomb. The turbine refused to spool. 8 engineers in desert fatigues surrounded the aircraft, their faces masks of frustration and mounting panic. Tablets glowed uselessly in their hands, displaying green lights that meant nothing when the engine stayed dead. Taliban mortars whistled in the distance. The bass thump of explosions rolled across the desert floor, each one closer than the last. 6 pilots stood by the operations tent, helmets in hand, watching their ride home, refuse to wake up. The lead engineer, a captain with sweat-carving rivers through the dust on his face, slammed his fist against the fuselage. His voice cracked when he shouted over the wind that they were out of time, out of options, out of luck. Technical Sergeant Dalton Mitchell stood apart from the chaos. 30 years old, lean in a way that spoke of hard miles and missed meals, he watched the engineers cycle through their diagnostics for the 4th time. He didn't carry a tablet. His hands, already scarred from 100 repairs under worse conditions, hung loose at his sides. When the captain started talking about calling for evac and leaving the Hornet behind, Dalton moved. He didn't ask permission. He walked straight to the engine cowling and placed his palm flat against the metal. The engineers stopped talking. Dalton closed his eyes. The storm howled. Mortars thumped. Somewhere a radio squawked about enemy movement 2 clicks out. Dalton heard none of it. He listened deeper to the silence beneath the noise, to the spaces between heartbeats where machines whispered their secrets. There, a metallic ping, 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 faint as a dying breath, buried under the wind and the chaos. His eyes snapped open. He pointed to the 3rd stage compressor and spoke 6 words that would save lives. Debris lodged in the intake blade. The engineers stared. One started to argue about sensor readings. Dalton was already moving, pulling tools from his belt, opening the panel with movements so precise they looked rehearsed. His fingers found the bolt fragment before anyone else could blink, a 2-inch piece of shrapnel that had survived an explosion and found its way into the one place it could kill an engine. He held it up to the light. The engineers went silent. 60 seconds later, the turbine roared to life with a sound like thunder-given voice. Captain Garrett Landry, the squadron leader who would remember this moment for the rest of his life, grabbed Dalton by both shoulders. The words came out rough, grateful, tinged with the kind of relief that only comes when death takes a step back. Dalton's response was quiet, almost lost in the engine noise. "Just doing the job, sir." The Hornet lifted off 15 minutes later, carrying 6 pilots who would live to see their families again. Dalton watched it disappear into the dust-brown sky, then walked back to his toolkit like nothing had happened at all. The alarm clock screamed at 5:45 on a Friday morning in late October 2024. Dalton's hand found it in the dark, silenced it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been waking up alone for 3 years. The bedroom was small, the furniture minimal. A single photograph sat on the nightstand in a silver frame. Caroline in her nurse's scrubs, her smile catching light from a hospital corridor, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from helping people heal. Dalton stared at the image for exactly 10 seconds, the same ritual he performed every morning. He whispered to the empty room, his voice rough with sleep, and something deeper. "Morning, Caro. Wish you were here for this one." The silence that answered him had weight. He rose, moved through the bathroom routine with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to function on autopilot. The mirror showed a face that had aged harder than 43 should. Gray salted his temples, lines carved deeper than his years around eyes that had seen too much. His hands, when he held them under the light, carried the permanent stains of engine grease that no soap could completely erase. Calluses mapped his palms like topographical surveys of a lifetime spent turning wrenches. The kitchen light revealed Iris already awake, standing on a step stool at the stove, stirring oatmeal with the concentrated focus of a surgeon performing delicate work. 8 years old, dark hair pulled into a ponytail, wearing pajamas decorated with cartoon planets. She looked up when her father entered, her smile immediate and genuine in a way that made his chest tighten every single time. "Morning, Dad. Big plane day." Her voice carried the particular clarity of a child who had learned early to articulate her thoughts with precision. "Just routine maintenance, kiddo." Dalton moved to the refrigerator, opened it to grab milk, and froze. The envelope taped to the door stared at him with red letters that screamed final notice. $12,000, due by April 30th. Medical bills from Carolyn's last year, still bleeding his bank account dry. He grabbed the milk, closed the door, forced his expression into something that wouldn't worry his daughter. Iris held up her wrist, showing him the vintage Timex watch that had belonged to her mother. The leather band was worn soft, the face scratched from years of use, but the second hand swept around the dial with metronomic perfection. "Mom's timer says 6:03. We're on schedule." The pride in her voice, the way she treated that watch like a sacred object, made something break and heal simultaneously in Dalton's chest. "Your mom was never late for anything." He kissed the top of her head, breathed in the smell of her shampoo, let himself have this moment before the day demanded he become someone else. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence. Iris talked about her science project on sound waves, how Mrs. Martinez said it was advanced for her grade level. Dalton listened, added encouraging words, and tried not to think about the bills piling up or the job that paid enough to survive but not enough to thrive. The morning news played low on the kitchen radio. A voice announced merger talks, corporate acquisitions, the kind of high-stakes business that happened in worlds far removed from his. The drive to Silverwing Aviation took 20 minutes through Dallas suburbs, still waking up. Dalton's Ford truck, a vehicle older than some of his coworkers, rattled over potholes and sang its familiar song of mechanical aging. Iris sat in the passenger seat, watching the world slide past her window. The radio cycled through advertisements and traffic reports. When a news segment mentioned Silverwing's CEO preparing for a crucial flight to New York, Iris turned to her father with questions in her eyes. Mrs. Martinez at school said her dad owns Silverwing. She said he has his own plane. Her tone carried no envy, just the simple curiosity of a child trying to understand how the adult world arranged its hierarchies. "A plane's just a machine, sweetheart. What matters is who takes care of it." Dalton kept his eyes on the road, but his hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. That job security he clung to felt suddenly more fragile in the morning light. "Is that why you fix them? Because someone has to care?" Iris possessed an uncomfortable talent for asking questions that cut straight to the bone. Something like that. He pulled into the employee parking lot of Silverwing Aviation as the sun finally cleared the horizon, painting the hangars in shades of copper and gold. The facility sprawled across 10 acres of prime Dallas real estate. 3 massive hangars dominated the landscape, each one large enough to swallow commercial airliners. The main building, all glass and steel and architectural ambition, reflected the morning sky like a mirror. Executive parking sat closest to the entrance, reserved spots marked with names that appeared on quarterly earnings reports. Dalton's truck found its usual place in the far lot between a maintenance van and another pickup that had seen better decades. He walked Iris to the employee daycare facility, a small building tucked behind the main offices. The woman at the desk, Mrs. Patterson, greeted them with the warmth of someone who had watched Iris grow up within these walls. Other children were already arriving, deposited by parents who worked in maintenance, administrative support, custodial services. The people who kept Silverwing running but would never see their names on reserved parking spaces. Iris hugged her father before joining the other kids. She whispered in his ear, her breath warm against his cheek. "Promise you'll pick me up at 3 for Pizza Friday?" The ritual question, asked every week, always with the same underlying need for certainty. "Always, baby girl. Now go learn something your mom would be proud of." He watched her disappear through the door, waited until she looked back and waved, then turned toward Hangar C with the weight of the day settling onto his shoulders. The morning shift had already started. Dalton clocked in at 6:47, exactly 13 minutes early, a habit ingrained from military service that had never left him. The maintenance board displayed the day's assignments in neat digital rows. His name appeared next to a single line, G700 Pre-Flight Inspection. The Gulfstream G700, $75 million of aerospace engineering, the crown jewel of Silverwing's executive fleet. Dalton grabbed his tool bag, a battered canvas thing that had survived 2 deployments and 13 years of civilian service, and approached the aircraft. The hangar smelled of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the particular metallic tang that came from precision machinery. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in stark clarity. The G700 sat in the center of the space like a sculpture, its white fuselage gleaming under the lights, the Silverwing logo painted in elegant silver script along the tail. Beautiful machine. Dalton ran his hand along the wing, feeling for imperfections his eyes might miss. "Let's make sure you're ready to fly." Pre-flight inspection followed a rhythm learned through repetition. Tires first, checking pressure and tread wear. Landing gear hydraulics, searching for leaks or stress fractures. Fuel lines, every connection tested with fingers that could detect problems before gauges registered them. Oil levels measured, fluid samples examined for contamination. Every system nominal, every check mark earned. At 7:15, Dalton signed off on the inspection form, declared the aircraft ready for service, and started walking back toward the maintenance office. The radio crackled to life before he made it halfway across the hangar. Natalie Brennan's voice, tight with tension that made every word sound like it cost her something. "All personnel, Hangar C, emergency. Now." Dalton turned and ran. By the time he reached the G700, a crowd had already formed. 9 engineers clustered around the port engine, their body language broadcasting confusion and mounting panic. Dr. Grayson Pierce stood at the center, tablet in hand, his Caltech PhD, making him the default authority on anything involving complex systems. The flight crew occupied the cockpit, going through startup procedures while everyone else watched and waited. The ignition sequence began. Fuel pumps hummed to life, a sound Dalton knew as intimately as his own heartbeat. The solenoid clicked. Air rushed through the intake with a whoosh that should have led somewhere. Instead, the engine coughed once and died with a thud that echoed through the hangar like a coffin lid slamming shut. Dalton pushed through the crowd, his mechanic's instincts already cataloging the failure. "What's happening?" His question cut through the murmuring engineers. Grayson looked up from his tablet, his expression carrying the particular frustration of someone encountering a problem that refused to follow the rules. "Engine won't engage. We've cycled it 4 times. Every sensor shows green. Fuel pressure, perfect. Electrical sequence, nominal." His hands moved across the screen, pulling up data streams that meant nothing because the machine refused to cooperate with its own diagnostics. The hangar doors opened. Natalie Brennan entered at a pace just short of running. 34 years old, operations director for the past 6 months, she carried herself with the careful control of someone always aware that she was being watched, judged, measured against impossible standards. Her tablet glowed in her hand, displaying schedules and stakes that made her jaw tight. Status? The single word carried volumes of unspoken pressure. Unknown. Grayson's admission clearly cost him. All sensors show green. Fuel pressure perfect. Electrical sequence nominal. He repeated the litany like a prayer that had stopped working. Natalie checked her watch, a gesture Dalton recognized from his own daughter. The same need to mark time, to count down toward consequences. CEO boards in 75 minutes. If we miss this flight, the merger collapses. Her voice stayed level, professional, but her eyes betrayed the calculations running behind them. Jobs at risk, careers on the line, her own future balanced on whether this engine decided to start. Dalton opened his mouth to offer assistance. Grayson cut him off without looking up from his tablet. "Not now, Dalton. This requires actual engineering." The dismissal was casual, automatic, the kind of professional slight that happened so often it had become invisible to everyone except the person being dismissed. The digital clock on the hangar wall updated itself. T-minus 75 minutes glowed in red numerals that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. The engineers huddled together, speaking in technical jargon that danced around the central problem. They had no idea what was wrong. Grayson took charge with the confidence of someone whose education had convinced him that every problem had a solution discoverable through proper analysis. Let's run a full FADEC diagnostic. Connect to the main computer. A junior engineer scrambled to comply, plugging a laptop into the aircraft's diagnostic port with hands that shook slightly from the pressure. 3 minutes of processing. Screens filled with data streams, cascading numbers and graphs that painted a picture of perfect function. The result appeared in bold letters across the display. All systems nominal, no faults detected. Grayson stared at the screen like it had personally betrayed him. That's impossible. His professional certainty wavered, just for a moment, before reasserting itself with effort. Try manual ignition sequence. The pilot flipped switches in the cockpit. Fuel pump hummed. Solenoid clicked. Air whooshed. Engine thudded into silence. 6th failure. The engineers' conversations grew louder, more desperate, cycling through possibilities that grew increasingly unlikely. Dalton stood at the edge of the crowd, apart but present, his eyes tracking not the screens, but the machine itself. He listened. While the engineers argued about software protocols and sensor calibrations, Dalton closed his eyes and let the sound of each failed attempt wash over him. The hum of the fuel pump, steady and strong. The click of the solenoid valve, delayed by a fraction of a second that most ears would never catch. The whoosh of air intake, slightly weaker than it should be. The thud of combustion failure, final and damning. A pattern emerged, visible only to someone who had learned to hear machines speak. That click. It's late. The words came out barely above a whisper, More observation than declaration. Natalie had moved closer without him noticing. She turned to him with the expression of someone grasping for any lifeline in reach. Late? What do you mean? The solenoid valve. The timing's off. 200 milliseconds. Maybe less. But it's there. Dalton opened his eyes, found himself looking directly at her. The auxiliary air valve is sticking. Natalie's expression shifted toward something like hope. Should I tell Grayson? Before Dalton could answer, a new presence filled the space behind them with the weight of authority and expensive cologne. Warren Thornberg arrived like weather, his $50 haircut and $1,000 suit marking him as someone who lived in different economic atmospheres than the people who actually touched the machines. Vice President of Engineering and Supply Chain, a title that gave him power over budgets and contracts and the careers of everyone in this hangar. His eyes, sharp and calculating, moved from Natalie to Dalton with the speed of someone assessing threats and opportunities simultaneously. Tell Grayson what? His voice carried the particular smoothness of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Dalton straightened, met the VP's gaze directly. Sir, I think the auxiliary air valve is experiencing mechanical delay. The solenoid response time is... You think? Warren's smile didn't reach his eyes. Natalie, why is a mechanic speculating about aerospace engineering? The question was directed at her, but his gaze never left Dalton, pinning him in place with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years learning how to make people feel small. Natalie's voice gained an edge. Dalton has experience. 13 years military, 5 years here. He's diagnosed experience changing oil and mopping floors. Warren cut her off with surgical precision. Dr. Pierce has a doctorate from Caltech. He published papers on turbofan efficiency that redefined industry standards. Let the professionals work. The words professionals landed like a slap, drawing a clear line between those who belonged in this conversation and those who did not. Dalton kept his voice level, professional, swallowing the anger that wanted to surface. Sir, I've diagnosed engine failures for 13 years, in combat zones, under conditions that, in the military. Warren's interruption came faster this time, on outdated equipment. This is a $75 million Gulfstream with cutting-edge technology. Your ears, however well-intentioned, aren't qualified to assess systems this complex. He turned to Natalie, dismissing Dalton without another glance. The auxiliary valves are brand new, installed during last month's 500-hour overhaul. From my company, Thornberg Aerosystems. They passed FAA certification with perfect marks. They cannot be the problem. Something in the way Warren's hand clenched when he mentioned his company caught Dalton's attention. A tell, subtle, but there. The kind of unconscious gesture that revealed more than words. Warren had stake in those valves beyond professional pride, personal stake, financial stake. The engineers were failing again. Another attempt, another thud, another cloud of frustration settling over the hangar. Grayson's voice rose above the others, sharp with desperation. We've checked fuel injectors, spark timing, compression ratio, everything. Every system shows optimal. The computer says this engine should be running. His education had prepared him for problems with logical solutions, not mysteries that defied data. Another engine failure. Smoke this time, acrid and black, pouring from the cowling. Fire suppression activated automatically. Foam cascading over the turbine in white clouds that turned the hangar into something from a dream. The digital clock updated. T-minus 60 minutes. The number glowed like a countdown to detonation. Natalie's phone rang. The name on the screen made her posture shift from tense to rigid. Howard Brennan, CEO, father. She answered with a voice that fought to stay professional. Yes, father. The speaker carried his voice to everyone within earshot. Natalie, I'm 20 minutes out. Tell me my plane is ready. The authority in those words didn't ask. It commanded reality to conform. We're experiencing a technical difficulty. Father, the engine won't. She tried to explain, but he rode over her words like they were obstacles to be demolished. I don't want explanations. I want solutions. This merger is worth $500 million. 300 people lose their jobs if we fail, including you. The threat was delivered with the casual certainty of someone who had never had to fear consequences. The call ended. Natalie stood holding her phone like it had transformed into something venomous. We have 1 hour. The words came out flat, stripped of emotion by the effort of maintaining control. Dalton watched her face, saw the calculations running behind her eyes. Career death balanced against protocol. Her father's approval weighed against her own judgment. The pressure of being the boss's daughter amplified every decision into a referendum on her competence. He made his choice, stepped forward before caution could stop him. Ma'am, please, let me check the auxiliary valve housing. His request was simple, direct, stripped of pride or ego. Natalie looked at him like he was offering salvation or suicide, unable to determine which. Grayson, can we open the valve housing? She directed the question to the lead engineer, seeking professional cover for the decision she wanted to make. Grayson looked up from his tablet, frustration making his words sharp. It's sealed with industrial sealant and safety wire. Takes 15 minutes minimum to open. We have 55 minutes left. The implied message was clear. They didn't have time for mechanics' hunches. I can do it in 8. Dalton kept his voice steady, matter of fact, the same tone he had used in Afghanistan when lives depended on speed and certainty. Warren materialized at Natalie's elbow with the uncanny timing of someone who had learned to sense when control might slip from his grasp. Absolutely not. That housing contains precision components worth $50,000. One mistake and you'll cause more damage than we already have. His objection carried weight backed by title and apparent expertise. Sir, the valve is already damaged. That's why it's failing. Dalton met Warren's eyes, refused to look away from the challenge he saw there. Based on what evidence? Your feelings? Warren's smile grew sharper, the kind of expression that came before professional executions. The hangar had gone quiet. Other workers had gathered at the edges, drawn by the conflict like witnesses to an accident. Warren raised his voice, playing to the audience with practiced ease. Listen up. I appreciate Mitchell's enthusiasm. I really do. But we have actual engineers here with actual degrees working on this problem. Dalton, your role is to check tire pressure and refill fluids. Leave the complex diagnostics to people who understand the science. Each word was a nail, carefully placed, driven home with authority. Grayson looked uncomfortable. Richard, that's a bit harsh. Even he recognized the humiliation being inflicted. Warren turned on him with the speed of a predator sensing weakness. Dr. Pierce, are you suggesting a mechanic knows more than you? The question was a trap, and they both knew it. No, sir. Grayson's capitulation was immediate, instinctive, the response of someone who had learned early that challenging authority cost more than it gained. Warren returned his attention to Dalton with satisfaction clear in his expression. Mitchell, you're dismissed. Return to your normal duties. The order was final, absolute, delivered with the certainty of someone who expected obedience. And if the plane doesn't start? Dalton's question hung in the air like smoke. Then we'll handle it, without your interference. Warren's smile never wavered. The moment stretched. Dalton opened his mouth to argue, to push back, to risk everything on being right. Movement in the hangar doorway stopped him cold. Iris stood there, small and terrified, having escaped the daycare to find her father. She had heard everything. Seen her father dismissed, humiliated, made small in front of a crowd. Tears streamed down her face, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. Dalton's world narrowed to his daughter's expression. The fight went out of him in a rush that left him hollow. He crossed the hangar floor, knelt in front of Iris, pulled her into a hug that tried to shield her from what she had already witnessed. "Daddy, why is that man being mean to you?" Her voice shook, confused by adult cruelty she was too young to understand. "Grown-ups disagree sometimes, baby. It's okay." The lie tasted bitter, but he needed her to believe it more than he needed to be honest. "But you're right. I can hear it too. The machine is crying." Iris pulled back enough to look at her father's face, her certainty absolute in the way only children could achieve. The words hit Dalton like physical blows. "You can hear it?" His surprise was genuine. Iris nodded, solemn and sure. "Mom always said machines talk to people who listen. You taught me to listen." The memory surfaced unbidden, sharp and clear. Caroline showing a younger Iris how to hear the family car's engine, explaining that every machine had a voice if you cared enough to understand it. "I know I'm right, Emmy, but sometimes being right isn't enough." Dalton stood, lifted his daughter, felt the weight of her trust and the burden of his own inadequacy. "Mom's watch says you never give up. You saved those pilots in the desert." Iris touched his face with small hands that carried her mother's certainty. That was different. The words came automatically. A defense against hope. How? The single-word question that children wielded like weapons against adult rationalizations. Dalton had no answer. He carried Iris back to the daycare, deposited her with Mrs. Patterson despite her protests, promised he would see her at 3 o'clock for pizza, like always. He walked back toward the maintenance office, each step feeling like retreat, like failure, like every choice that had brought him from Afghanistan to here had been wrong. The maintenance office was small, institutional, decorated with safety posters and schedules that nobody read. Dalton sat at his desk, stared at the photograph of Caroline that lived there in a frame identical to the one at home. Different picture, same smile. The clock on the wall marked T-minus 45 minutes with red numerals that felt accusatory. Over the radio, another failed start attempt, the 8th failure. The sound traveled through the facility's speaker system, a public announcement of ongoing catastrophe. Dalton's hands clenched into fists tight enough that his knuckles went white. He stared at Caroline's photograph like it held answers. "What would you do, Becca?" The nickname slipped out unconsciously. The private name he had used when they were alone, when the world narrowed to just the two of them. The photograph didn't answer. Memory did instead. Caroline in her hospital bed during the final week, her body ravaged by cancer, but her mind sharp as ever. She had made him promise something, extracted the oath with the fierce determination of someone who knew she was leaving instructions that would have to last a lifetime. "Dalton, promise me something." Her voice in his memory was weak but absolutely certain. Anything. His younger self had meant it with every fiber of his being. "When I'm gone, don't let Iris see you give up. Show her what integrity looks like, even when it costs you." The words had been a commandment, a final gift disguised as a request. I promise. He had kept that promise for 3 years, through grief and poverty and the daily grind of survival. He had kept it through every humiliation, every dismissal, every moment when the world tried to make him smaller than he was. Dalton looked at the clock. T-minus 40 minutes. He looked at Caroline's photograph. He thought about Iris watching him walk away, about 300 jobs hanging in balance, about a machine crying for help that only he could hear. He grabbed his tool bag. I'm sorry, baby. I can't watch this fail. The apology was directed at Caroline's memory, at the promise he was about to keep by breaking every rule Warren had laid down. The walk back to Hangar C felt like marching into enemy territory. The engineers were attempting another start when Dalton arrived, moving with purpose that made people step aside without realizing they had done it. He walked straight to the auxiliary valve housing, pulled out wire cutters, began the work of opening a system he had been ordered not to touch. Warren's voice cut through the hangar like a siren. Security! Remove this man! His face had gone red, fury transforming his professional composure into something uglier. Dalton didn't stop. His hands moved with the efficiency of long practice, cutting safety wire, cracking sealant, pulling the housing free. Natalie, I'm opening this valve. Fire me after if you want. The statement was calm, factual, accepting consequences before they arrived. 2 security guards advanced. Natalie stood frozen between competing pressures, her father's wrath balanced against her own judgment, protocol warfare against desperation. Dalton, I can't authorize this. Her voice carried apology and uncertainty in equal measure. 300 people lose their jobs if this plane doesn't fly, including your father. Are you going to stop me because of protocol? Dalton met her eyes, let her see the certainty there, the willingness to sacrifice himself if it meant solving the problem. Grayson spoke up, his voice quiet but carrying across the sudden silence. Let him open it. The admission of defeat in those words cost him visibly. Warren turned on the engineer with the speed of a striking snake. What? His single word vibrated with authority, challenged. We've tried everything else. Grayson met his VP's glare with resignation that looked like courage. What do we have to lose? Natalie made her decision. The words came out harder than Dalton had ever heard her speak. Stand down. She directed the order at the security guards without looking away from Warren. Warren's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. Natalie, you're making a career-ending mistake. The threat was naked now, stripped of professional courtesy. It's my call, Richard. Natalie's use of his first name shifted the power dynamics subtly but unmistakably. To Dalton, quieter. You have 10 minutes. The housing came free in Dalton's hands. He pulled the auxiliary valve assembly out, held it up to the light. The component looked perfect, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, gleaming chrome testimony to precision engineering. Grayson, manually cycle it. Dalton's request was professional, colleague to colleague, the hierarchy forgotten in the face of the problem. Grayson pressed the valve stem with a screwdriver. Snap. The valve closed cleanly. Snap. Again, perfect. The third cycle produced a sound that made every engineer in the hangar lean closer. Snaps. A hesitation, microscopic but present, the mechanical equivalent of a stutter. There, you see it? Dalton's voice carried satisfaction and vindication in equal measure. Grayson examined the valve under the harsh worklight, his educated eye finally seeing what Dalton's educated ear had known all along. The return spring. Third coil. There's a hairline fracture. His admission came quietly, the sound of a worldview adjusting to accommodate new reality. The crack was barely visible even under magnification, a line so fine it might have been a reflection if not for the way it caught the light at certain angles. Dalton pulled the spring free, held it up for everyone to see. This 3-cent piece of metal was about to cost $75 million. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Dylan checked the other auxiliary valves, all 4 of them. Dalton's instincts, honed by years of finding patterns and failures, pushed him toward the conclusion he didn't want to reach. The junior engineer opened valve number 2. Same fracture. Valve 3, identical crack. Valve 4, the pattern held. The engineers stared at the evidence like it had betrayed them personally. Grayson's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the hollow quality of someone whose certainty had just died. They're all defective. This isn't random failure. This is systematic. He turned to Warren with accusation building in his eyes. These valves passed quality control. Warren had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. That's impossible. Those valves are from a certified supplier. The protest sounded weak, even to his own ears. Dalton checked the part number stamped into the valve housing. Thornberg Aerosystems, TA4501. The numbers meant nothing to most people in the hangar. To Natalie, they connected dots she had been trying not to see. These are from your company? Her question was quiet, dangerous in its restraint. Warren's composure fractured. I disclosed the supplier relationship to the board. It was approved. The valves were 20% cheaper than competitors. His defense came too fast, too rehearsed. The sound of someone who had prepared arguments in advance. 20% cheaper because you cut corners on metallurgy. Dalton's accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. The CEO's motorcade chose that moment to enter the facility. The sound of luxury vehicles crunching across gravel carried into the hangar like approaching thunder. T-minus 35 minutes glowed on the clock, each second burning away like fuse cord. Warren backed toward the door, his professional mask slipping to reveal something closer to panic. I need to brief Mr. Brennan. The excuse was transparent, a retreat disguised as duty. Natalie's voice stopped him. You'll stay right here, Richard. Her authority, questioned and undermined for months, suddenly reasserted itself with force. To the security guards, escort Mr. Thornberg to his office. Lock the door. The order was clear, final, the kind of command that ended careers or saved them. Warren started to protest. The guards moved before he could form words, professional and implacable. He was gone 30 seconds later, his absence leaving a vacuum that the engineers rushed to fill with speculation and recrimination. Dalton stood holding the defective spring, his mind already moving past Vindication toward the bigger problem. We have a bigger problem. Even if we replace the valves, we don't have 35 minutes. His assessment killed the brief moment of satisfaction that had followed Warren's departure. Natalie turned to him with an expression that mixed hope and desperation in equal measure. Then, what do we do? Dalton looked at the engine, at the valves, at the clock counting down toward consequences that would ripple through 300 lives. Something I swore I'd never do again. The admission cost him, dredging up memories of other desperate repairs in other desperate circumstances. Howard Brennan entered the hangar flanked by executives and lawyers and the particular aura of someone accustomed to problems solving themselves in his presence. 62 years old, silver hair perfect despite the early hour, Suit tailored to communicate authority without ostentation. Captain Garrett Landry walked beside him, pilot's uniform pressed and professional, eyes that had seen combat scanning the scene with practiced assessment. Someone explain why my $75 million aircraft is in pieces. Howard's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. Authority resided in his tone like water in a well, deep and certain. Natalie stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Father, we discovered defective valves in the auxiliary air system. All 4 components show identical structural failures. Her professional tone couldn't completely hide the daughter seeking approval beneath. Defective? Howard's eyes narrowed. We completed a 500-hour overhaul last month. Every component was certified. His gaze swept the hangar, landing on Dalton with the weight of someone accustomed to identifying the person actually responsible for solutions. And you are? Dalton Mitchell, sir. Maintenance technician. Dalton met the CEO's eyes without flinching, military bearing asserting itself unconsciously. Explain what we're looking at, Mr. Mitchell. The request carried the weight of command disguised as courtesy. The auxiliary air intake valves are failing due to hairline fractures in the return springs. All 4 valves show identical defects. The sensors couldn't detect the mechanical failure because they measure electrical signals, not physical response time. Dalton's explanation was clear, technical without being condescending. The voice of someone who had learned to brief officers who expected precision. How long to replace 4 valves? Howard directed the question at Grayson. 45 minutes minimum, sir. We need to source new parts, install them, calibrate the system, run diagnostics. Grayson's estimate was professional, accurate, and damning. Howard checked his watch with the same gesture Dalton had seen in Natalie, the family resemblance suddenly clear. I have 33 minutes before I miss the New York window. If I miss that meeting, the merger collapses. $500 million. 300 jobs. He let the stakes hang in the air like sword blades. We don't replace them. Dalton's voice cut through the silence that had followed Howard's pronouncement. Every head turned. He continued before anyone could interrupt. We bypass the auxiliary system entirely. Route all air intake through the primary valve. It's designed to handle the load. Grayson's professional instincts warred with desperate hope on his face. That violates every safety protocol in the manual. The auxiliary system is redundancy for emergency situations. This is an emergency. Dalton kept his voice level, factual, letting the logic speak for itself. Captain Landry had been silent, watching Dalton with an expression that cycled from curiosity to recognition to something like wonder. He stepped forward suddenly, his movement cutting through the discussion like a knife. Wait. Mitchell? Dalton Mitchell? His voice carried urgency that made everyone stop. Dalton turned, really looked at the pilot for the first time. Recognition hit like electricity. Captain Landry, Sir, Helmand Province, March 2011, FA-18 with debris in the compressor. Landry's voice gained intensity with each word. You saved my squadron. 6 pilots who would have died if that Hornet stayed grounded. His attention shifted to Howard. Mr. Brennan, this man is a legend. I've seen him diagnose failures that stumped engineering teams with master's degrees. If he says bypass the auxiliary system, I'd trust him with my life. Howard studied Dalton with new interest, reevaluating based on testimony he couldn't easily dismiss. Jack, this is different. Military aircraft versus civilian regulations. The insurance alone. Principles are the same, sir. Landry's interruption was gentle but firm. The question isn't whether it's orthodox. It's whether it works. To Dalton, directly, can you guarantee this bypass configuration? Dalton met the pilot's eyes, remembered that day in Afghanistan, the weight of lives hanging on his judgment. No guarantees in this business, Captain, but I've seen it done. Primary only configuration on damaged fighters. It works for flights under 2 hours. Your run to New York is 2 hours, 15 minutes. Tight, but within parameters. Howard's silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. The clock updated. T-minus 30 minutes. Somewhere in the building, phones were ringing, schedules were collapsing, consequences were accumulating like compound interest. The CEO looked at his daughter. Natalie, it's your call. The use of her first name, the acknowledgement of her authority, even in crisis, shifted something fundamental in the hangar's atmosphere. Natalie looked at Dalton, at the defective springs still held in his hand, at the clock counting down. If this fails mid-flight? Her question was professional, necessary, but her eyes pleaded for the answer she wanted. Primary valve is overbuilt for exactly this kind of scenario. It won't fail. Dalton spoke with the certainty of someone who had staked his life on similar judgments and survived. But safety protocols specifically state. Grayson started to recite regulations like prayers. Protocol assumes normal operating conditions. Dalton cut him off without heat. These aren't normal conditions. This is triage. Save the patient or watch them die while following procedure. Natalie's decision crystallized in her expression before she spoke the words, "Do it. Dalton, you lead. Grayson, assist him." Her voice carried the weight of someone stepping off a cliff and hoping she could fly. Howard nodded once, acceptance and approval combined. "You have 28 minutes. Don't waste them arguing." He turned and walked toward the aircraft, Captain Landry at his side, both men moving like they had already decided to trust the outcome. The engineers became a team in that moment. Hierarchy dissolved by urgency. Dalton's hands moved with the efficiency of long practice, pulling tools, disconnecting the auxiliary valve electrical connectors with movements that looked rehearsed because they essentially were. Grayson worked beside him, their earlier antagonism forgotten in the face of shared purpose. Together, they rerouted air pressure lines, redirecting the intake flow to concentrate everything through the single primary valve. The work was delicate, precise, the kind of task that could not be rushed, but could not afford delay. Dalton's fingers moved through the confined spaces of the engine compartment with the confidence of someone who had performed similar operations blind, in darkness, under fire. Grayson handled the computer recalibration, his doctoral education finally finding practical application as he rewrote fuel injection algorithms on the fly. 20 minutes became 15, 15 became 10. The primary valve pressure gauge climbed to 112% of normal capacity, within tolerance but pushing limits. Dalton double-checked every connection, every seal, every point of potential failure. No second chances existed at 30,000 feet, T-minus 5 minutes. The hangar had gone silent except for the sound of tools and keystrokes and breathing that came faster than calm would suggest. Dalton torqued the final bolt, tested the seal one last time, stepped back to survey the work with critical eyes that searched for flaws. Bypass complete. Ready to test. The announcement carried across the hangar like a verdict. Howard Brennan was already boarding the aircraft, Captain Landry moving through pre-flight checks in the cockpit with practiced efficiency. Natalie stood at the edge of the workspace, her tablet forgotten in her hand, her entire career balanced on whether this engine would start. Iris appeared in the hangar doorway again, having escaped daycare through determination and fear and the absolute certainty that her father needed her. She ran across the concrete floor, small feet slapping echoes that turned every head. Dalton caught her, lifted her, felt her arms wrap around his neck with desperate strength. "Is it going to work, Daddy?" Her question was whispered directly into his ear, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "Yes, baby, it's going to work." The lie or the truth, Dalton couldn't tell which, but he needed her to believe it with the same certainty she brought to everything else. Iris pulled back enough to see his face. Her hand went to her wrist, to her mother's watch, fingers touching the leather band like a talisman. "Mom's watch says you're the bravest person she knew." Her voice carried absolute conviction. The pilot's voice carried over the intercom. "Initiating start sequence." The words were professional, matter-of-fact, betraying nothing of the stakes involved. Everyone held their breath. Dalton set Iris down, positioned her behind him, one hand on her shoulder in unconscious protection. His other hand hung loose at his side, but his attention focused entirely on the engine that was about to pass judgment on every decision he had made. The fuel pump engaged. The sound was familiar, correct. The first note in a symphony that might end in catastrophe or vindication. The solenoid clicked. Click, sharp, precise. No delay this time because the valve it controlled was bypassed. Irrelevant. Air rushed through the primary intake. Whoosh! Louder than before, carrying 4 times the normal volume, pushing the single valve to limits it was designed to handle, but rarely asked to bear. Then came the sound no one wanted to hear. Bang! An explosion of combustion that wasn't controlled, wasn't right, was the mechanical scream of something failing catastrophically. Black smoke poured from the engine like blood from an arterial wound. The fire alarm shrieked. Foam suppression systems activated automatically, covering the turbine in white clouds that turned the hangar into something from a nightmare. "Shut it down!" Grayson's voice cracked on the words, professional composure finally shattering under the weight of public failure. The engine went silent. Smoke continued to rise, acrid and choking, carrying the smell of burning metal and destroyed hope. The foam settled slowly, revealing an engine that had tried to tear itself apart. Dalton stood frozen, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. It should have worked. The words came out barely audible, talking to himself more than anyone else. "I've done this exact configuration. It should have worked." Grayson pulled up diagnostic data with shaking hands. Primary valve temperature 340 degrees. It's failing. The overload is burning it out. His voice carried the particular horror of someone watching their worst predictions come true. Howard Brennan descended from the aircraft with the controlled fury of someone whose time had just been wasted by incompetence. His face showed no emotion, which was somehow worse than rage. "Mitchell, you said it would work." The statement was flat, factual, an accusation that didn't need embellishment. "Sir, I don't understand. This configuration has worked before, under worse conditions." Dalton's certainty was crumbling, ground reality destroying theoretical knowledge. "Well, it doesn't work now, and my plane is damaged, possibly beyond immediate repair." Howard turned to security guards who had materialized as if summoned. "Remove Mr. Mitchell from the premises. Immediately." "Sir, if you just give me 5 more minutes to—" Dalton started to beg, hated himself for it. Couldn't stop. "You've had your chance. You failed." Howard's judgment was final, absolute, carrying the weight of someone who had made 10,000 similar decisions and learned never to second-guess himself. Security guards gripped Dalton's arms, not roughly, but firmly enough to communicate that resistance would be futile and painful. Iris screamed and ran to her father, wrapped her small body around his leg, like she could anchor him through sheer force of will. Dalton knelt, pulled his daughter into an embrace that tried to shield her from witnessing his failure, his humiliation, his absolute defeat. "It's okay, baby. Daddy made a mistake. Sometimes our best isn't good enough." The words came from some distant place where parents still had to comfort children even when their own worlds were ending. "You didn't. You can fix it." Iris turned to Howard with the fierce courage of a child who hadn't yet learned that adults could be immovable. "Please, Mr. CEO man, give him one more chance. My daddy saves planes. He saved the fighter planes in the desert." Howard looked at the crying child with an expression that might have been sympathy if sympathy could coexist with the kind of pressure he carried. "Little girl, your father cost me $500 million. He's fortunate I'm not pursuing criminal charges for sabotage." The words hit Dalton like physical blows. He stood, lifted Iris despite her protests, started walking toward the exit with security guards flanking him like an honor guard at a funeral. Behind him, he heard Grayson's quiet apology. "I'm sorry, Dalton." The words followed him out of the hangar like ghosts. The October sun had climbed higher while disaster unfolded inside, turning the asphalt parking lot into a griddle that radiated heat in shimmering waves. Dalton's boots crunched across gravel that had witnessed 1,000 arrivals, but few departures like this. Iris sobbed against his shoulder, her small body shaking with the kind of grief that comes from watching a parent destroyed. The security guards had stopped at the hangar entrance, professional enough to recognize that escorting a man carrying his crying daughter to his truck crossed from duty into cruelty. The Ford sat where he had left it 3 hours ago, back when the day still held possibility instead of ruin. Dalton fumbled with the door handle, his hands unsteady for the first time since Afghanistan. He set Iris in the passenger seat with a gentleness that belied the chaos roaring through his skull. Her face was blotchy red, tears still flowing, her mother's watch clutched against her chest like the only solid thing left in a world gone liquid. "Daddy, why are you crying?" Her question cut through his attempt at composure. He hadn't realized moisture tracked down his own face until her small fingers reached up to touch his cheek. "Because I failed, sweetheart. I failed everyone." The admission tasted like ash, like the smoke still rising from the engine he had promised would run. His voice broke on the last word, years of military discipline crumbling against the simple honesty of his daughter's gaze. Iris wiped his tears with the back of her hand, the gesture so achingly similar to something Caroline would have done that Dalton's chest tightened until breathing became work. "No, Mama said you were the bravest man she knew." Her certainty hadn't wavered despite witnessing his humiliation twice in one morning. "Your mama was wrong about me." The words came from a place deeper than thought, darker than he wanted his daughter to see. 3 years of holding himself together, of being strong enough for both of them, fractured under the weight of this moment. Iris's expression shifted from sadness to something fiercer. She grabbed his face with both hands, forced him to meet her eyes. "No. Mama said you saved the planes because you loved the pilots. You loved them like you love me." The intensity in her 8-year-old voice carried echoes of Caroline's nursing shift determination, the force of will that had kept patients fighting when their bodies wanted to quit. Dalton stopped moving. The parking lot sounds faded. Somewhere a mockingbird called. Traffic hummed on the distant highway. His daughter's words replayed in his mind, each syllable landing like hammer blows against the armor of his self-recrimination. "Did you love that plane, Daddy?" Iris's question was simple, direct, cutting through complexity to reach the bone underneath. "No, I was trying to prove I was smart." The realization hit him with the force of revelation. He had been fighting Warren, fighting the engineers, fighting for Vindication instead of listening to the machine the way he had in Afghanistan when ego didn't matter and only results counted. Then go back, and this time, listen like you love it. Iris released his face, sat back in her seat with her arms crossed, looking so much like Caroline in that moment that Dalton nearly broke again. Dalton closed his eyes. Shut out the parking lot, the day, the humiliation. Reached for the memory of that last failed start. Not the smoke or the alarm or the catastrophe. The sound beneath all that. The actual mechanical voice of the machine trying to tell him something he had been too angry to hear. The fuel pump had hummed correctly. The solenoid had clicked with perfect timing because the auxiliary valves were bypassed. The air intake had whooshed with 4 times normal volume through the primary valve. Then the bang. But before the bang, in the microsecond gap between air rush and combustion failure, there had been another sound. A series of small clicks, rapid fire, almost lost in the chaos. Tick, 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 tick. His eyes snapped open. The injector sequence. The words came out strangled, urgent, understanding flooding through him like electricity through copper wire. What? Iris leaned forward, sensing the shift in her father's energy. The fuel injectors. They're firing in the wrong sequence. The computer is sending fuel to all 8 cylinders simultaneously instead of sequentially. That's why the primary valve overheated. Dalton was already opening the truck door, already moving before conscious thought caught up with instinct. Can you fix it? Hope bloomed in Iris's voice like spring after endless winter. Maybe, if I can sync the computer to a perfect timing reference. Dalton paused, 1 foot on the ground, turned back to his daughter. Stay here. Lock the doors. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Iris pulled her mother's watch from her wrist, held it out to him with both hands like she was offering something sacred. Mom's watch has a heartbeat. Can you hear it? She placed the Timex in his palm, closed his fingers around it. The second hand swept around the dial with mechanical precision. Dalton held the watch to his ear. Tick, 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 tick. Perfectly regular. Radio-controlled synchronization to atomic time. Never losing a second. Carolyn had worn this watch through 12-hour nursing shifts, through sleepless nights with a newborn, through chemotherapy appointments where time moved like cold honey. It had kept running when her heart stopped. You're brilliant, baby. He kissed Iris's forehead, tasted salt from her tears. Stay here. Trust me. I always trust you, Daddy. Her voice followed him as he ran back toward the hangar, the watch clutched in his fist like a talisman against failure. The hangar entrance loomed. Dalton burst through expecting resistance, found chaos instead. Howard Brennan stood at the center of a hurricane, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand chopping the air in gestures of controlled fury. Natalie hovered at his elbow, her professional composure stripped down to raw anxiety. Grayson and the other engineers had formed a defensive cluster near the wounded engine, their body language broadcasting defeat. Howard's voice carried across the space with the particular coldness that came from watching millions evaporate. I don't care about backup planes. I care about this plane. The one I was promised would be ready. His attention shifted as Dalton approached. "I thought I had you removed." "Sir, I know what's wrong." Dalton kept walking, ignoring the security guards who started to intercept. The bypass worked. "The primary valve is fine. The problem is fuel injection timing." Grayson looked up from his tablet, exhaustion and hope warring on his features. "Dalton, the FADEC is calibrated to auxiliary mode timing." Dalton cut him off without malice. "You updated the air routing, but not the fuel delivery algorithm. The computer is trying to run aux mode fuel injection through a primary-only air intake. The valve is drowning." Grayson's fingers flew across his tablet, pulling up data he should have checked before, seeing the error that had been invisible under pressure. Oh God. He's right. The injection sequence is still staggered for 4 valves, but we only have 1 valve now. How long to fix it? Howard's question was sharp, precise, the voice of someone recalculating odds in real time. 5 minutes to recalculate the algorithm. But we have another problem. Grayson's professional honesty wouldn't let him oversell the solution. The FADEC's internal clock has drifted 0.3 seconds from atomic time. That drift is enough to throw off the fuel injection timing at these volumes. The hangar went silent. 1/3 of a second didn't sound like much until you understood that combustion happened in milliseconds, that timing was everything, that precision meant the difference between controlled burn and catastrophic failure. Captain Landry, who had been standing near the aircraft listening, stepped forward. His weathered face carried the particular intensity of someone who had spent 30 years learning to recognize when details mattered. "What do you need for timing reference, Mitchell?" Dalton held up Caroline's watch. "This radio-controlled synchronization to NIST atomic clock, accurate to nanoseconds. If we can interface the timing module with the FADEC computer, we can sync the fuel injection to perfect atomic time." Grayson stared at the vintage Timex like it was alien technology. "You want to use a wristwatch to control a $75 million turbine?" His engineering education struggled against the elegant simplicity of the solution. "I want to use atomic time to control the turbine. The watch is just the delivery mechanism." Dalton kept his voice level, letting the logic speak for itself. Caroline had worn this watch through 1,000 emergencies. She had trusted it to keep her on schedule when seconds meant lives. He would trust it now. Howard checked his watch, the irony not lost on anyone. "We have 8 minutes before the window closes completely. Can you make this work?" "Yes, sir." Dalton said it with the same certainty he had carried in Afghanistan, the absolute conviction that came from knowing rather than hoping. "Then do it. And Mitchell, if this works, you're hired back. With a raise." Howard's offer was transactional, businesslike, but genuine. If it fails, we're all looking for new jobs anyway, so we might as well go down swinging. Grayson was already moving, clearing workspace near the engine, pulling tools and laptops and cables. His earlier antagonism had burned away, leaving behind the kind of focused cooperation that emerged when survival trumped ego. Together, he and Dalton worked with the efficiency of people who had discovered they made a good team despite themselves. The watch case opened under Dalton's screwdriver to reveal the timing module, a small circuit board packed with components that spoke to cellular towers and atomic clocks and the invisible infrastructure that kept modern time synchronized. Grayson handled the software interface, writing code that would translate atomic pulses into fuel injection commands. His fingers flew across the keyboard with the speed of someone whose entire education had prepared him for exactly this kind of improvisation. 3 minutes became 2. Wires connected circuit board to aircraft computer. Code compiled, uploaded, executed. The FADEC display flickered, synchronized, locked onto the atomic signal broadcasting from Caroline's timing module. Fuel injection algorithm updated from simultaneous to sequential, staggered across 8 cylinders in the precise rhythm that would distribute load evenly across the single primary valve. Dalton's hands were steady now, fear replaced by focus, doubt burned away by purpose. He checked every connection twice, verified every parameter, gave the machine the kind of attention he should have given it from the beginning, not proving anything, just listening, just caring, ready to test. Grayson spoke the words quietly, like he was afraid to jinx the moment with too much volume. Howard was already boarding the aircraft. Captain Landry moved through the pre-flight checklist with movements polished smooth by 10,000 similar preparations. Natalie stood at the edge of the workspace, her phone dark and forgotten, her entire future compressed into the next 60 seconds. Dalton straightened, stepped back from the engine, let the work speak for itself. His eyes tracked to the hangar entrance where Iris stood framed in sunlight, having disobeyed his instruction to stay in the truck. She pressed both hands against the glass, her face solemn and trusting and terrified in equal measure. He raised one hand slightly, a gesture meant to reassure her or himself. He couldn't tell which. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Starting engine sequence. Final attempt. The subtext was clear. If this failed, there would be no more chances. Fuel pump engaged. The sound was identical to every previous attempt. The prelude that could lead to triumph or disaster with equal probability. Solenoid clicked. Click. Sharp and clean, the auxiliary valves silent in their bypassed irrelevance. Air rushed through the primary intake. Whoosh! 4 times normal volume, pushing the single valve to its engineered limits. Then came the sound that would determine everything. Tick, 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 tick. The fuel injectors firing in sequence, controlled by atomic precision, distributing combustion across 8 cylinders with the rhythmic perfection of a heartbeat. The sound built, grew, transformed from mechanical clicking into something deeper. The turbine caught. The ignition roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder, the voice of $75 million worth of aerospace engineering doing exactly what it was designed to do. The engine sustained power, smooth and steady and absolutely perfect. No smoke, no alarms, no catastrophic failures, just pure mechanical symphony. The monitors blazed green, every system nominal, combustion efficiency 100%, primary valve temperature holding steady at 285 degrees, well within safe parameters. The FADEC computer displayed timing synchronization locked to atomic precision, fuel injection dancing to Caroline's heartbeat. The hangar erupted. Engineers shouting, hugging, releasing tension that had compressed them for 2 hours into something approaching joy. Grayson grabbed Dalton's hand, shook it with genuine gratitude that transcended professional rivalry. We did it. His voice carried wonder like he couldn't quite believe success was allowed. Dalton barely heard him. His attention fixed on Iris, who had both hands pressed against the glass, tears streaming down her face, her mouth forming words he couldn't hear but understood perfectly. I knew it. I knew you could. The G700 began to taxi, its single primary valve handling the load like it had been designed for exactly this configuration all along. Captain Landry's voice came over the hangar speakers, professional and calm but carrying an undercurrent of satisfaction. Silverwing Tower, G700 requesting runway clearance. We are flight ready. The tower's response crackled back. G700, you're cleared for runway 18. Winds calm. Have a good flight, Captain. Outside, the aircraft turned toward the runway. its engines singing the song of perfect function. Acceleration, the nose lifted, wheels separated from Earth. The G700 climbed into cloudless Texas sky, vapor trails marking its passage like silver ribbons against blue canvas. Howard Brennan and Captain Garrett Landry carried $500 million toward New York, carried 300 jobs toward salvation, carried futures that had been poised on the knife edge of catastrophe into something approaching security. Natalie stood watching the aircraft disappear, her phone finally buzzing to life as the tower confirmed successful departure. Her shoulders dropped like someone had cut strings that had been holding her upright through will alone. She turned to Dalton with an expression that mixed exhaustion and gratitude and something like awe. "You saved us." The words came out quiet, private, meant for him alone despite the crowd around them. "We saved us." Dalton gestured toward Grayson, toward the other engineers who had worked the problem from their own angles. This wasn't solo work, but you heard what nobody else could. Natalie's phone rang again. She glanced at the screen, saw her father's name, answered with visible relief. "Yes, Father?" Her voice steadied as she listened to whatever Howard said from 30,000 feet. The merger meeting was saved. The company was saved. She had proven herself in the crucible. Dalton didn't wait to hear more. He walked toward the hangar entrance where Iris still stood, her face pressed against glass that had fogged from her breath. He pushed through the door, knelt in front of his daughter, and pulled her into an embrace that tried to communicate everything words couldn't reach. "I'm sorry you had to see that. See me fail." His apology was whispered into her hair. Iris pulled back enough to see his face, her expression serious beyond her years. "You didn't fail. You fell down. Then you got back up." That's what Mama always said brave means. Her wisdom, delivered in a child's voice, carried more truth than any engineering degree. "Your mama was smarter than me." Dalton managed something close to a smile, the first genuine expression of anything other than stress he had worn all morning. The hangar door opened again. A figure stood silhouetted against midday brightness, hesitant and somehow diminished despite the expensive suit. Warren Thornberg stepped inside like he was walking to his own execution, his earlier authority stripped away to reveal something more human underneath. Security had released him at some point during the successful engine start, apparently deciding he posed no further threat. The hangar conversation died. Engineers stopped celebrating to watch Warren's approach with the attention usually reserved for car accidents or public shamings. He walked straight to the center of the space, pulled his phone from his pocket with hands that shook slightly, and played an audio recording that filled the silence like poison. His own voice echoed through the hangar speakers. The phone call from earlier, preserved in digital amber. The words about valves failing as predicted, about keeping the CEO delayed, about protecting contracts, about sabotage disguised as cost savings. Warren played the entire recording, his face gray beneath expensive suntan, his expression that of a man who had looked into a mirror and found a stranger staring back. The recording ended. Warren cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the sudden quiet. "I designed those valves, cut corners on metallurgy to win the Silverwing contract at below-market prices. The manufacturing defect was predictable. I knew they would fail." His confession came in bursts, each admission costing visible effort. "I've reported myself to the FAA, submitted this evidence to the board. My company is done. I'll face criminal charges for fraud, for endangering lives. Why are you telling us this?" Natalie's question carried genuine confusion rather than accusation. Warren looked at Iris, still held in her father's arms, her mother's watch visible on her wrist. Because that little girl sacrificed something precious to save people she doesn't know. And His voice failed. He tried again. I almost destroyed 300 families for profit. You all deserved the truth. He extended the phone toward Natalie like he was offering evidence at his own trial. The FAA will want this. So will your lawyers. Natalie took the phone with the care of someone handling explosives. Warren turned to leave, stopped, looked back at Dalton with something that might have been respect or might have been envy for someone who could still look at themselves without flinching. Mitchell, for what it's worth, you were right about everything. The admission was quiet, meant only for Dalton's ears, but the hangar acoustics carried it to everyone present. Then Warren Thornberg walked out of Silverwing Aviation for the last time, his back straight, but his spirit visibly crushed under the weight of his own choices. The door closed behind him with a finality that sounded like punctuation on a finished chapter. 2 hours passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls and the slow deflation that follows adrenaline. Howard Brennan's jet landed safely in New York. The merger meeting happened on schedule. $500 million changed hands in transactions that would keep 300 people employed and Silverwing Aviation solvent. Natalie fielded calls from board members, from her father, from lawyers who wanted to discuss Warren's confession and the implications for company liability. Dalton sat in Natalie's office, uncomfortable in a space designed for executives rather than mechanics. The chair was too soft, the air conditioning too cold. The view through floor-to-ceiling windows showed runways and sky and a world that suddenly looked different than it had this morning. Natalie ended her latest call, set her phone face down on the desk with deliberate care. My father wants to speak with you. She touched her screen, activated the speakerphone, and Howard Brennan's voice filled the office with the particular satisfaction of someone who had just closed a successful deal. Mitchell, the merger is signed. $500 million secured. Every job saved. Howard paused. Let the magnitude settle. Put you on speaker. I want you to hear this clearly. You're promoted. Lead diagnostic consultant. Base salary $135,000. Company vehicle, full medical and dental, and a $50,000 education fund for Iris. The numbers hit Dalton like physical impacts, more money than he had earned in his best military year, enough to pay off Caroline's medical debt in 6 months instead of 6 years, enough to save his house, enough to stop choosing between groceries and electricity. Sir, I don't... The gratitude tried to form words and failed. You saved this company. Captain Landry told me about Afghanistan, about the kind of man you are. We need that here. Report to Natalie Monday morning. She'll show you your new office. Howard's tone shifted slightly, became more personal. And Mitchell? Thank you. My daughter told me how close we came to catastrophe. You stood up when it mattered. Just doing my job, sir. The response was automatic, military. The same words he had used 13 years ago in a desert on the other side of the world. Well, now that job comes with a corner office and parking near the entrance. See you Monday. The call disconnected, leaving silence that felt heavier than words. Natalie smiled, genuine warmth breaking through professional reserve. Welcome to management, Dalton. She stood, extended her hand across the desk. He shook it, still processing the transformation from fired mechanic to consultant in the span of 3 hours. There's more. She gestured for him to follow her out of the office, down corridors he had only seen from a distance, past conference rooms and executive spaces, to a hangar wall he had walked past 100 times without really seeing. Workers were installing a memorial plaque, bronze with engraved lettering that caught the afternoon light. In memory of Caroline Mitchell, the heart that keeps us flying. Below the inscription, someone had mounted a photograph. Caroline in her nurse's scrubs, the same image Dalton kept on his nightstand, enlarged and professionally framed. Her smile seemed to light the wall, her eyes carrying the particular joy of someone who had found purpose in service. Dalton stopped breathing. The world narrowed to that photograph, to those words, to the reality that his wife's memory would live in this place beyond his own grief. "Your father approved this?" His voice came out rough, scraped raw by emotion he couldn't contain. "I suggested it." He agreed immediately. Natalie stood beside him, both of them looking at Caroline's face. Her watch saved us today. Her legacy should help others reach for the sky. We're also establishing the Caroline Mitchell Memorial Scholarship. Full ride for children of Silverwing employees pursuing STEM education, starting with Iris when she's ready. The kindness broke something in Dalton that failure hadn't touched. He turned away before Natalie could see tears, before he had to explain that gratitude and grief could occupy the same space without destroying each other. "Thank you." The words were inadequate, but all he had. 3:00 arrived with the inexorable certainty of atomic time. Dalton collected Iris from daycare, where Mrs. Patterson had apparently heard about the morning's drama and greeted him with the particular warmth reserved for local heroes. Iris chattered about her day, about the science project, about how Mrs. Patterson said her daddy was famous now. Not famous, kiddo. Just lucky. Dalton kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind still processing the day's transformation. September arrived with cooler mornings, and the particular clarity of light that came after summer's humidity finally broke. 3 months had transformed Silverwing aviation in ways both visible and subtle. The maintenance hangar now displayed diagnostic protocols printed on laminated cards mounted beside every workstation. "Listen First Initiative," the headers read, followed by procedures that married computer analysis with hands-on assessment. Junior engineers rotated through manual training alongside their digital education, learning to feel for problems their sensors might miss. Dalton's new office occupied space on the second floor with windows overlooking Hangar C. The nameplate outside read, "Lead Diagnostic Consultant," in letters that still felt like they belonged to someone else. Inside, his desk held the same photograph of Caroline, the same coffee mug from his maintenance days, but also technical manuals and training schedules, and the accumulated paperwork of someone responsible for teaching rather than just doing. The transition from wrench turner to consultant had been smoother than expected, though his hands still itched for tools when engineers described problems in abstract terms. Iris thrived in private school, where the education fund provided opportunities Dalton had only imagined. Her science fair project on acoustic diagnostics had won first place, earned her an invitation to present at a regional STEM conference. She wore her mother's watch every day, the leather band now softened by 3 more months of constant wear. Teachers commented on her unusual maturity, her ability to articulate complex thoughts with precision. Dalton recognized Caroline in every parent-teacher conference, every report card that came home with grades his daughter had earned through her mother's determination. The medical debt disappeared in July, paid off in a single transaction that left Dalton staring at a zero balance like it was written in a foreign language. The house was safe. The truck still ran. Money accumulated in accounts that had spent years gasping for oxygen. He slept better than he had since Caroline's diagnosis, though some nights still found him awake at 3 a.m., talking to her photograph about decisions he didn't know how to make alone. Warren Thornberg pleaded guilty to fraud charges in August, accepted a 7-year sentence without fighting. His company liquidated to pay restitution to airlines that had purchased defective components. The news coverage was brief, corporate malfeasance being too common to sustain public attention. Dalton felt no satisfaction in Warren's fall, only the hollow recognition that fear made people destroy themselves in ways more thorough than any external enemy could achieve. Friday afternoon in late September found Dalton walking through Hangar B, where a newer Gulfstream G650 sat with landing gear extended for inspection. A young mechanic, barely 23, with a fresh technical certification and eager eyes, crouched beside the hydraulic actuator with a tablet displaying green readings across every parameter. His frustration showed in the set of his shoulders, the way he kept refreshing the diagnostic screen like different results might appear through repetition. "What's the problem?" Dalton approached quietly, not wanting to startle someone clearly on edge. The mechanic looked up, recognition flashing across his face. "Mr. Mitchell." Dalton. The nervous correction revealed someone still learning how to address authority that insisted on first names. "Landing gear actuator. Pilot reported vibration during retraction cycle. Software diagnostics shows nominal function across all systems." His tablet screen glowed with the familiar green lights that meant nothing when the machine disagreed with its own sensors. "What do you hear?" Dalton kept his voice neutral, the question simple but carrying weight beyond its words. Confusion crossed the young mechanic's features. "Sir, I'm looking at the acoustic waveform analysis. The computer shows..." Put the tablet down. The instruction was gentle but firm. "Close your eyes. Cycle the landing gear manually." The mechanic hesitated, clearly wrestling with training that emphasized data over intuition. His hand moved toward the manual override switch with the uncertainty of someone stepping off solid ground. Eyes closed. The landing gear began its retraction sequence. The sound filled the hangar. Whir, click, thunk. Smooth and mechanical, the voice of hydraulics doing their job. Again. Whir, click, thunk. Normal. The third cycle produced variation so subtle, most people would miss it entirely. Whir, click, tick, tick, thunk. A stutter in the rhythm, metal against metal in a pattern that shouldn't exist. The mechanic's eyes opened wide. There was ticking. In the hydraulic pump. How did I miss that? Genuine frustration colored his voice, the kind that came from caring about competence. "Because you were reading the machine instead of listening to it." Dalton moved closer to the actuator, gestured for the mechanic to join him. "What does ticking in a hydraulic pump usually indicate? Air in the lines?" The answer came tentatively, theory being tested against reality for the first time. "Exactly. Bleed the hydraulic system. Check for leaks in the reservoir seal while you're at it. 10-minute fix." The diagnosis was simple, the solution straightforward, the kind of problem that disappeared once you knew where to look. The mechanic's expression cycled through relief and embarrassment in rapid succession. "That's it? I've been staring at this for 40 minutes. His education had prepared him for complexity, but not for simplicity, hiding in plain sound. The machine told you the problem in the first 30 seconds. You just had to care enough to hear it. Dalton placed one hand on the younger man's shoulder, the gesture carrying encouragement rather than criticism. "Your sensors are tools. Your ears are instruments. Learn to trust both." The young mechanic nodded, already pulling tools. But before Dalton could leave, a question stopped him. "Mr. Mitchell, can I ask something personal?" Dalton turned back. The mechanic's eyes carried vulnerability that came with youth and uncertainty. People talk about what happened in October. The G700. They say you got fired, then saved the company in the same day. His words tumbled out, rushed. I need to know. How did you come back after failing? After everyone saw you fail? The question hung in the hangar air, honest and raw. Dalton considered the young face, saw himself 13 years ago, saw every mechanic who'd ever doubted their instincts under the weight of expert opinion. I didn't come back because I was brave. I came back because my daughter reminded me what mattered. He moved closer, voice dropping. You want the real answer? I failed because I was trying to prove I was smart. I succeeded when I started trying to prove the machine could fly. The difference, one's about ego, the other's about love. Dalton gestured at the aircraft around them. These machines, they don't care about your education or your credentials, or whether you're right. They care whether you listen. Whether you give a damn if they make it home. The mechanic absorbed this, something shifting behind his eyes. You'll fail again. Dalton's honesty was surgical, so will I. The question isn't whether you fall. It's whether you let pride keep you down, or whether you love the work enough to get up and listen better next time. How do you learn to love it? The machines, I mean, when they're just metal? Dalton thought of Caroline, of Iris, of every person who trusted him with their lives compressed into aluminum and titanium. You remember that every machine carries people home to someone who loves them. You remember that your job is sacred, even when nobody's watching, even when nobody thanks you. You remember that mechanics don't just fix metal. We protect families. The young mechanic straightened slightly, like receiving a commission. Now go bleed that hydraulic line, and write it up properly. Documentation saves lives 6 months from now when someone else encounters the same problem. Yes, sir. And stop calling me sir. I work for a living. Dalton's smile took the edge off. It's Dalton. After the mechanic left, Dalton stood alone in the hangar, surrounded by aircraft in various stages of maintenance. Each one represented hundreds of hours of human work, thousands of decisions, millions of trust points between mechanics and passengers who would never meet. His phone buzzed. Text from Grayson. Board meeting Tuesday. Want you to present the listen first results. Numbers are incredible. Dalton pocketed the phone. Numbers. They always wanted numbers to prove what couldn't be quantified, that listening saved lives, that experience mattered, that love was a diagnostic tool as valid as any sensor. But if numbers got more mechanics listening, he'd give them numbers. Iris materialized at Dalton's elbow with the uncanny timing children possessed for appearing exactly when summoned by thought. She had walked from the employee child care facility alone, confident in her familiarity with the building, her backpack decorated with patches showing planets and spacecraft. Dad, it's 3 o'clock. Her voice carried the particular emphasis of someone reminding about sacred obligations. Pizza Friday? The young mechanic's face lit with recognition. I heard about that tradition. My supervisor said you never miss it, not once in 4 years. Dalton took Iris's hand, the familiar weight and warmth grounding him in present tense. To the mechanic, fix that leak, write up your findings, then go home early. Friday afternoons are for family. They walked toward the parking lot through corridors Dalton now navigated as consultant rather than maintenance tech. Other employees greeted him by name, asked technical questions, sought approval for training modifications. The transformation still felt surreal, like wearing someone else's life over his own. The new Ford F-250 gleamed in its designated parking space near the entrance, company vehicle emblazoned with Silverwing diagnostic services in professional lettering. Dalton missed his old truck with the loyalty objects inspired through shared hardship, but Iris loved the new one's backup camera and Bluetooth speakers. 2 weeks before this particular Friday, Dalton had sat in the back of Iris's classroom for Parent STEM Night. 20 folding chairs filled with mothers and fathers, all watching 8-year-olds explain science projects with the earnest intensity only children could muster. Iris stood at the front, her project board displaying waveform diagrams and photographs of aircraft engines. She wore the Timex watch like a talisman, her presentation printed on note cards she decorated with stars. My project is called Listening to Machines: Acoustic Diagnostic Methods in Aviation Maintenance. Her voice carried without wavering, loud enough to fill the room, but not shouting. She'd practiced this, Dalton realized, had practiced being brave. Most people think computers are smarter than humans at finding problems. Iris gestured to a photograph of a diagnostic tablet. But computers can only measure what they're programmed to hear. Humans can hear. She paused, searching for the word Grayson had taught her. Anomalies, things that shouldn't be there. A parent raised their hand. How do you know what shouldn't be there? Because every machine has a voice. When it's healthy, it sounds one way. When it's sick, it sounds different, just like people. Iris's comparison was simple, devastating. My mom was a nurse. She could hear when patients' breathing changed, when their hearts weren't right. My dad's a diagnostic consultant. He can hear when airplane engines are crying for help. The room had gone quiet in that particular way adults went silent when children said something profound. Iris pulled a recording device from her pocket, one Dalton had helped her set up. This is a healthy hydraulic pump. She played the sound, whir, click, thunk. Smooth. This is a pump with air in the lines. Whir, click, tick, tick, thunk. You hear the ticking? Heads nodded around the room. That ticking saves lives. Because if a mechanic hears it and fixes it, the plane lands safely. If they don't hear it, or if they trust the computer that says everything's fine, the plane might crash. Iris's matter-of-fact delivery made the stakes clear without dramatization. So listening isn't just about being quiet. It's about caring enough to hear what others miss. Mrs. Martinez, standing at the side of the room, had tears in her eyes. Iris continued, "My mom died 3 years ago from cancer." The final slide appeared. Caroline's photograph, the same one from the Hangar Memorial. Before she died, she told my dad to always listen for the quiet. She said truth lives in quiet places, and fear makes too much noise. She clicked to her final slide. The Timex watch, photographed in detail. This was my mom's watch. It keeps perfect time because it syncs to atomic clocks. My dad used this watch to save a $75 million airplane and 300 jobs. Not because it's expensive or fancy, because it listens to something bigger than itself and stays synchronized with truth. The room sat in absolute silence. My conclusion is, humans aren't better than computers. Computers aren't better than humans. But when humans listen, really listen, to machines and to each other and to truth, that's when we can do things computers alone never could. We can care. We can love. We can save lives. Thank you for listening. Applause erupted, but Dalton barely heard it. He was watching his daughter carefully return her note cards to their folder, adjust her mother's watch, and walk back to her seat with the quiet dignity Caroline had carried through hospital corridors. After the presentations, parents clustered around Iris's project board, asking questions she answered with patient precision. Mrs. Martinez approached Dalton, who stood apart watching his daughter shine. "She's extraordinary." The teacher's voice carried wonder. "I've taught for 20 years. I've never had a student explain mechanical systems with that level of clarity or that level of heart. She gets the heart from her mother." Dalton's throat tightened. The clarity she earned herself. "She told me she wants to be an aerospace engineer. Design systems that talk clearly to people who listen." Mrs. Martinez smiled. "I told her she'd better start learning advanced mathematics now. She asked if she could stay after school twice a week for extra math tutoring." Dalton felt pride and grief collide in his chest. "That's very her. Mr. Mitchell, can I ask?" The teacher hesitated. "How did you teach her to be so fearless, after losing her mother so young?" "I didn't teach her to be fearless." Dalton watched Iris demonstrate her sound recordings to another student's parents. "I taught her that fear is just noise, and that love is worth standing back up for." That's what her project was really about, wasn't it? Not hydraulics or diagnostics. No. Dalton smiled. It was about the same thing everything's about: love that refuses to quit. The drive to Salvatore's followed routes worn smooth by repetition. Dallas traffic flowed around them in patterns Dalton had learned to read like weather. Iris talked about her day, about the math test she aced, about the coding class Mr. Pierce was teaching her during lunch periods. Grayson had become an unlikely mentor. His initial condescension transformed into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Do you miss it?" Iris's question interrupted her own narrative, the words carrying weight that suggested she had been building toward them. "Miss what, baby?" Dalton kept his eyes on the road but felt his attention sharpen. "Working with your hands instead of just teaching." The observation was accurate in a way that made him wonder how long she had been watching, noticing things he hadn't said aloud. Sometimes, Dalton considered the question with the honesty she deserved. But teaching means more people learn to listen. That saves more planes, helps more pilots get home safe. Your mama would say that's better impact than I could make alone. Is that why you do it? Because mama would want you to? Iris possessed an uncomfortable talent for questions that cut straight through comfortable rationalizations to reach bone. "I do it because it matters. Because those young mechanics remind me of who I was before I learned these lessons the hard way." The traffic light ahead turned red. Dalton stopped, turned to face his daughter fully. "And because every person I teach is someone who might save lives like your mama did. Different tools, same purpose." Iris nodded, satisfied by logic that connected service across professions. "I want to do that too. Help people fly. Not as a mechanic, though." Her qualification carried the particular certainty of someone who had thought this through. What then? Curiosity pushed past the traffic resuming flow. "Engineer, the kind who designs systems that talk clearly so people like you can hear them better." Iris spoke with the casual confidence of 8-year-old ambition untainted by understanding how hard the path would be. "Mr. Pierce says I have aptitude for algorithmic thinking." Her pronunciation of the technical term was careful, practiced. "You'll be better than all of us." Dalton meant it without reservation, could already see his daughter's trajectory arcing higher than his own. Salvatore's neon sign buzzed its familiar welcome when they arrived. The same booth waited, vinyl seats worn softer by another season of Friday dinners. The menu came without being requested, the server knowing their order before asking. The ritual unfolded with the comfort of repetition, each element precisely placed like notes in a familiar song. Pepperoni and mushroom arrived steaming. cheese stretching between slices and golden strands that made Iris giggle the way she had since she was old enough to eat solid food. They consumed the first piece in appreciative silence, honoring the pizza's effort with focused attention. The second piece came with conversation. Mrs. Martinez said her dad sold his company shares. She's moving to California. Iris delivered the news with the matter-of-fact tone children used for major life changes happening to others. That's Warren Thornberg's daughter? Dalton had known intellectually that consequences rippled beyond the guilty party, but hadn't connected specific children to abstract outcomes. Iris nodded. She cried during lunch, said her dad made bad choices, and now everything's different. The observation carried no judgment, just reporting of facts as witnessed. How do you feel about that? The question emerged before Dalton fully formed it. Parenting instinct checking emotional temperature. Sad for her, but glad you make good choices, even when they're hard. Iris took another bite, cheese clinging to her chin in a way that made her look younger than her years. That's what brave means, right? Doing the right thing when it costs you something? The wisdom delivered in a child's voice hit harder than any sermon. Yeah, baby. That's exactly what brave means. Dalton wiped cheese from her face with a napkin, the gesture automatic and tender. Your mama taught me that. Now you're teaching me to remember it. I learned from watching you. Both of you. Iris's smile carried echoes of Caroline's expression when she was particularly pleased with herself. They finished dinner as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the parking lot in shades of copper and gold. The drive home took them past Silverwing Aviation, where aircraft lifted into evening sky with rhythmic regularity, each departure a small miracle of metal and physics and human trust in systems working correctly. Overhead, a familiar G700 passed, its navigation lights blinking against darkening blue. That's Mr. Brennan's plane. Iris pointed through the window with the pride of someone claiming connection to important things. Because of Mama's heartbeat. Because of your Mama's heartbeat. Dalton corrected gently, making sure she understood the legacy belonged to Caroline rather than the machine. She kept time for us, even when her own time ran out. Do you think she knows? The question had evolved from earlier iterations, carrying different weight now. About your promotion? About the scholarship? About us still doing pizza Fridays? I think she knows we kept our promises, that we're still flying. Dalton pulled into their driveway, the house that had nearly been lost, now secure and solid under evening light. And I think she's proud of the woman you're becoming. Smart and kind, and brave enough to give away precious things when it matters. Like the watch? Iris touched the Timex on her wrist, the daily companion that had survived its transformation from personal memorial to essential component and back again. Like the watch, Dalton killed the engine, sat in the cooling truck cab with his daughter, watching the day fade into night. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is let go of what we love so it can help people we'll never meet. That's what your mama did every shift at the hospital. That's what you did that morning in the hangar. I'd do it again. The statement was simple, absolute. The voice of someone who understood sacrifice at 8 years old in ways most adults never achieved. If it helped people fly home to their families. They sat together as the sky deepened from gold to violet, to the first appearance of stars. A companionable silence settled, father and daughter connected by shared loss and shared purpose, and the promises they kept to someone who couldn't witness their fulfillment, but whose presence remained woven through every choice. Inside the house, Dalton made hot chocolate despite the September warmth, ritual trumping logic. They sat at the kitchen table where Caroline's chair remained empty but not abandoned, occupied by memory that felt more solid than absence. Iris's homework spread across the surface, math problems and science diagrams, and the careful printing of someone learning to make thoughts visible. The wall calendar showed September giving way to October. 3 years since Caroline's death, approaching the milestone of 4. The grief had transformed from sharp edges to dull weight, from drowning to carrying, from something that destroyed to something that could be born. Dalton had learned to live around the hole her absence created, building new structures that acknowledged the space without trying to fill it. The final shareable truth crystallized in his mind, the kind of understanding that came from living rather than thinking. He spoke it aloud to his daughter, to Caroline's memory, to the empty air that held them both. Sometimes the most valuable person in the room isn't the one with the loudest voice or the most expensive education. It's the one who knows when to be silent and truly listen. Dalton placed his hand over Iris's smaller one, felt her mother's watch tick against his palm. Your mama taught me that. Now we teach it to others. That's how love keeps flying. Iris smiled, squeezed his hand, returned to her homework with the focused determination she had inherited from the nurse who saved lives and the mechanic who saved planes. Outside, another aircraft lifted towards stars, its timing perfect, its systems singing the quiet song of machines properly heard. The sound of silence had become the sound of truth, and that truth carried them all home.